What if I told you that one of hip-hop's biggest moguls, once written off as finished, might actually walk free despite the raids, the lawsuits, and the convictions? This isn't just about Diddy's freedom, it's about how power, money, and strategy can bend the justice system itself. I recently had the rare opportunity to sit down with one of Sean Diddy Combs' defense attorneys, Alexander, as the once powerful music mogul waits for his next chapter to unfold in federal court. With sentencing on the horizon, the question looming over him is whether he'll remain behind bars until then or be granted release in the meantime. Adding yet another twist, whispers of a possible presidential pardon have only fueled the intensity surrounding his case. The stakes could hardly be higher, not only for Diddy himself, but also for an industry that once placed him at its center. For months, Diddy's story has played out like a slow-motion downfall. He was once considered untouchable, a man who helped shape hip-hop culture, built empires in fashion and liquor, and defined an era of music. Now, his name is synonymous with scandal. Federal raids have rattled his inner circle, lawsuits have piled up, and former confidants once fiercely loyal have stepped forward with stories that paint a radically different picture of the mogul. It is not simply the weight of accusations, but the breadth of them that makes this saga so explosive. Allegations come from different voices, across different eras, creating a pattern that is difficult for the public to ignore. The silence from Diddy himself has been deafening. For a man who built his career on presence, bravado, and visibility, his choice to remain largely mute has marked a stark contrast. Instead, the heavy lifting has been left to his attorneys. Alexander, measured and careful with his words, projects a confidence that borders on audacious given the circumstances. The strategy, it seems, is not to fight the narrative blow for blow in the press, but to place faith in the system, a system many critics believe is tilted toward those with wealth and power. This raises deeper questions. Can the legal machine insulate someone from the weight of cultural opinion? And perhaps more importantly, should it? The public court has already rendered its judgment. Social media feeds are filled with calls for accountability. Former collaborators distance themselves. Fans wrestle with the tension between nostalgia for his contributions to music and revulsion at the allegations against him. Yet in the formal arena that matters most, the courtroom, the rules are different in court. Allegations are not convictions. A story, no matter how shocking, must be substantiated with evidence that meets a high threshold, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This is where Diddy's lawyers have fixed their gaze. They know that civil lawsuits, with their lower burden of proof, may paint him as culpable in the eyes of the public. But criminal court is a different battlefield entirely. For the defense, the strategy lies in exposing contradictions, highlighting gaps, and reminding jurors that suspicion is not the same as certainty. Alexander explained, in careful but deliberate terms, that the team's confidence stems from what the public doesn't see. Behind the headlines and the hashtags are reams of documents, recordings, and communications that tell a more complicated story. The defense believes that much of the testimony against Combs is undermined by written evidence, text messages, videos, and correspondence that capture events as they unfolded in real time. If a witness claims one thing years later, but their own words in the moment say another, credibility crumbles. And credibility, in the courtroom, is everything. Still, the optics cannot be ignored. Diddy's decline has played out like a cautionary tale, the fall of a titan in real time. There was a point not long ago when he epitomized success. The flashy parties, the champagne bottles, the aura of invincibility. Today, those same images serve as exhibits for critics who argue that his empire was built on exploitation and intimidation. The juxtaposition is almost cinematic. The mogul, who once danced in white suits on MTV, now shuffles into courtrooms flanked by lawyers. The man who once owned the narrative now finds himself trapped within one he cannot control. Yet even as the walls seem to close in, his legal team projects not desperation, but discipline. They insist the narrative of collapse is premature, that the story is not yet over. In fact, Alexander suggests, the tide may already be shifting. That belief is not rooted in bluster, but in the mechanics of the law. High-profile cases often become tangled in their own visibility. Investigations take years, and in the interim, leaks, rumors, and speculation shape public perception. By the time charges reach court, the audience has already been primed, but jurors are instructed to strip all of that away, to consider only what is presented under oath, in evidence. And that, the defense believes, is their strongest terrain. It is a strategy that feels almost paradoxical. Silence in the media age is often read as weakness, but in the courtroom, restraint can be strength. A defendant who testifies risks unraveling under cross-examination. A defense team that engages in media spats risks distracting from its case. By refusing to play that game, Diddy's attorneys are signaling confidence. They don't need to shout because they believe the evidence speaks for itself, of course. Whether the system itself will bend in his favor remains to be seen. History provides examples on both sides. Wealth and power have shielded some men from consequences. Others have seen their resources exhausted against the weight of government prosecution. What makes Diddy's case uniquely unsettling is the cultural dimension. This isn't just about one man's fates, about what his fate represents. If he walks free, does it validate critics who say the system favors the wealthy? Does it undermine the courage of those who spoke out? Or does it reaffirm the principle that accusations, however serious, cannot replace evidence? The possibility of a presidential pardon only complicates the narrative. The mere suggestion of executive intervention blurs the line between law and politics. It transforms the case from a personal scandal into a cultural flashpoint. For supporters, it could be seen as an act of mercy or fairness. For critics, it would symbolize everything broken about a system where influence matters more than accountability. As our conversation wound on, I found myself struck less by what Alexander said, and more by how he said it. Calm, deliberate, almost clinical. This wasn't the tone of someone scrambling to salvage an impossible case. It was the voice of someone who believes he has the upper hand or at least the tools to secure it. That, in itself, is part of the defense's power. To create not just legal doubt, but psychological doubt. If observers begin to wonder whether prosecutors have overreached, the narrative shifts. And in trials like this, perception is as much a weapon as any piece of evidence. Still, outside the courtroom, the damage may already be irreversible. The brand Diddy may never recover fully. Partnerships have dissolved. Business opportunities have evaporated. The hip-hop community, once quick to rally around him, has grown cautious, if not silent. Legal freedom does not guarantee cultural redemption. Even if he emerges from court untouched by conviction, he may never again occupy the pedestal he once built for himself. Yet perhaps that is why this case resonates so deeply. It isn't just about whether one man is guilty or innocent. It's about the tension between law and culture, between evidence and belief, between the truth as it is proven and the truth as it is felt. Diddy's story sits at that intersection, reminding us that justice is rarely simple. It is a process, slow and imperfect, and one that often leaves as many questions as answers. For now, the questions remain. Will he walk free before sentencing? Will a pardon come into play? Will the legal machine succeed where the cultural one has failed? One thing is certain. The saga of Sean Diddy Combs is far from over, and whatever the outcome, its ripple effects will be felt far beyond the courtroom.
About to do something that we've never done here on Sidebar. For a show that has covered every aspect of Sean Diddy Combs' criminal case, we are about to speak with one of his defense attorneys, Alexandra Shapiro. She is part of his legal team at trial. And the trial, by the way, that ended with Combs acquitted of the most serious charges: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking. He was convicted of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. They call these the Mann Act violations, moving women and men across state lines for the purposes of commercial sex work. Now, we have talked about Alexandra Shapiro before. She was the attorney, for example, who argued for admitting that video of rape accuser Mia wishing Combs a happy birthday after the alleged assault. She played a key role in this case. And with questions about could Combs' convictions be thrown out, what could he be sentenced to, will he make bail before he's sentenced, can he get a presidential pardon, this feels like a great opportunity to get some insight into all this and certain aspects of the trial, like why didn't they call Christina Coram? All right, so let me get right into it. I am joined right now by Alexandra Shapiro herself. Thank you so much for taking the time to come here on Sidebar. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I have a lot of things I want to get into. We will talk about all the latest developments. But first of all, I got to ask, what was it like to be part of a team like this one? Because you know, every argument, every question, it is going to be focused, debated, on a national, maybe an international stage. This is a major case. And also, by the way, you were representing somebody and are representing somebody who for the past 2 years has taken quite a hit in the media and wasn't the most popular figure in the last 2 years. So to be representing Sean Combs in this massive trial, what was it like for you?
I mean, it was actually an amazing experience. First of all, the team was fantastic. I mean, I've never worked with so many great lawyers with different talents meshing together. And it was great after I've been working on this case since last September, dealing with the client being just bashed in the media, bashed by a ton of frivolous civil lawsuits that just sort of whipped up the hysteria against him. It was great to finally be able to help him have his day in court. And so the actual witnesses could be heard, and we had a chance to really expose a lot of the truth of what was really behind all of this.
Obviously, this is a win, right? He was acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing. Did there ever become a time, though, during the course of the trial, maybe in the first several weeks, when you're like, I'm a little nervous, I think he may get convicted of racketeering or sex trafficking, or you were confident throughout the prosecution's case that they just weren't reaching their burden?
Well, we felt good about the trial most of the time and we're confident, but you never can be too confident in a federal criminal trial. I mean, especially in the Southern District of New York, the government almost always wins, and it's a huge challenge and really, really difficult to win. So we were always concerned.
It has often seemed as though the walls were closing in on Sean Diddy Combs, with pressure mounting from every direction. Yet, just when it appeared his legal options had run out, his defense team stunned both the public and the press, not through loud denials or media spin, but with a quiet, deliberate confidence. Their message is simple but striking. Diddy's freedom may not be fading at all, it may actually be closer than many ever imagined. That declaration reverberated across the entertainment industry, particularly because the outside world has been watching months of damaging headlines pile up, civil suits alleging predatory behavior, coordinated government raids, and testimony from former associates and partners describing troubling stories that stretch back decades. Through it all, Diddy himself has largely remained silent. Now, his lawyers are speaking for him, and rather than retreat, they're projecting strength to the media, prosecutors, and the culture at large. The signal is clear: don't count him out just yet. This sudden shift isn't accidental, it's strategy. For months, public opinion has been shaped by a barrage of reports, exposes, and rumors that hardened into something resembling truth. But the defense insists their case tells a different story. Their argument isn't that every witness was lying, it's more complicated than that. Some testimony, they acknowledge, contained truth, but truth that ultimately worked in Diddy's favor. Others, they argue, shaded the facts. What tilted the balance were the records, text messages, videos, and written communications created at the time of the alleged events. These documents, they claim, revealed context that undercut much of the prosecution's narrative and exposed contradictions the witnesses couldn't explain away. Inside the courtroom, the defense's strategy became even clearer. Cross-examination proved so effective that many observers wondered whether Diddy's team would bother calling their own witnesses. In the end, they chose not to. That decision wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Calling witnesses is always risky. Even a mostly favorable testimony can give the prosecution room to score points. If the government's case was already faltering, why take the gamble of shifting momentum? The defense leaned instead on the weaknesses in the prosecution's own presentation. A central question lingered around one figure in particular, Christina Korum, widely rumored to be a key co-conspirator. Her name surfaced repeatedly throughout testimony, and yet prosecutors never called her to the stand. To outside observers, this was shocking. To the defense, less so. Calling her, they reasoned, would have been a gamble that could backfire. In fact, several witnesses the government did present ended up helping Diddy's case more than hurting it. Adding Korum to the mix could have been an even greater liability. For Diddy's attorneys, this isn't about dominating headlines, it's about navigating strategy. And their approach highlights a fundamental principle of the justice system. Accusation is not conviction. While the public has largely written its verdict, the courts have not. The government's high-profile investigations, despite their scope, have yet to deliver a criminal conviction. Civil lawsuits, while damaging, demand far less proof than a criminal trial. In federal court, the standard is far higher beyond a reasonable doubt, and if the evidence can't withstand that burden, even the most damning allegation may collapse under scrutiny. Behind the scenes, sources suggest Diddy's defense has been working methodically to dismantle the government's case, piece by piece. Whether that effort ultimately secures his freedom remains to be seen, but the shift in tone, from defensive silence to outward confidence, signals that the battle is far from over. The courtroom buzz and non-stop media coverage raised the obvious question: would Sean Diddy Combs take the stand and tell his side of the story? It's ultimately his choice, and one with big risks attached. The defense attorney declined to disclose private conversations, citing attorney-client privilege, but confirmed the decision. Combs considered testifying and then opted not to. Their reasoning was practical. They believed the government's case had played into their hands and that calling him to testify might have been an unnecessary gamble. Then came another surprising development after the trial: the firing of the lead prosecutor, Maureen Kami. The defense described it as regrettable. By all accounts, she's a respected prosecutor, and the trial team maintained professional relations with her throughout the proceedings. Beyond that, the attorney declined to speculate, saying he couldn't comment further. Bail quickly became a central battleground. The defense's renewed motion argued for Combs' release pending sentencing, noting that he'd been cleared of the gravest counts and pointing to the lack of a close legal analog, someone convicted only under the Mann Act, rather than for sex trafficking or profiting from prostitution, who was nonetheless held in similar circumstances. They also raised concerns about conditions at the MDC, argued Combs isn't a flight risk, and said he poses no danger to the community. Could Judge Run Subramanian be swayed by those papers? The judge had flagged concerns about violence in his post-verdict comments, and that remains the sticking point. The defense pushed back by framing most of the cited incidents as belonging to the distant past, apart from one episode in June, which the defense described as an unusual, isolated flare-up that a witness said she initiated after years together. There was little recent evidence of violent conduct. The Intercontinental video cited at trial, the defense reminded the court, dates back nearly a decade. Combs' breakup with Cassie occurred in 2018. In support of release, the defense also lodged a letter from Gina Hunn, an ex-girlfriend identified as an alleged victim, attesting that she has seen real change and recommending bail. Throughout the trial, Diddy's team focused on attacking credibility, probing timelines, and exposing inconsistencies. In their view, the courtroom is where facts matter most, not headlines. That's why they leaned into a slow, methodical strategy: pick apart evidence, rely on primary documents, and avoid moves that might hand the prosecution momentum. They're careful not to claim innocence outright or to deny every allegation. Instead, they emphasize that legal outcomes hinge on what can be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and that civil suits operate under a far lower evidentiary bar. In short, the lawyers are playing the long game. Confident public statements signal they believe keyholes exist in the government's case, but whether that belief will translate into release or a different legal outcome remains an open question. The system's pace, they note, often dictates how these stories actually resolve, and not the daily headlines. Investigations rarely move quickly. They can stretch on for months, sometimes years, while the court of public opinion delivers its own verdict long before a judge or jury is involved. Diddy's defense team understands that dynamic and they're working to flip it. For them, the gap between perception and proof isn't a liability, it's an opportunity. While the media narrative leans heavily toward guilt, his lawyers are constructing a defense meant not only to shield him legally but to reshape his image. It's also a subtle warning. Unless prosecutors can secure a conviction, public outrage alone has no binding power. That doesn't mean Diddy will reclaim the cultural throne he once held. Even if cleared, the damage to his reputation may linger, but in the eyes of the law, he could emerge legally untouched, and that possibility alone has enormous consequences. Should he walk free, survivors who stepped forward might feel silenced, advocates could feel abandoned, and the entertainment industry would be left grappling with the uncomfortable truth of what it means when accusations stack high but prosecutions fall short. Public reaction has already revealed the fracture. Many were angered, frustrated, even disillusioned by the jury's decision. Yet just as many, and perhaps more quietly, celebrated it. For some, it was a victory for due process over mob judgment. For others, it was a reminder of how power and influence can bend the scales of justice. Either way, the verdict has left no one indifferent, and that is where the deeper reckoning begins.
Listening, to the evidence as it came in during trial, I thought that depending upon how a person, be it a juror, be it the public, comes into the trial believing how someone who's a victim should act and how they believe relationships can evolve or devolve and fall apart, is the lens that they would then make their verdict. Why I say that is because if you think a person who's battered, someone who's been a victim, someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described, most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting. You don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created, in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight.
And so, the greater message becomes clear. Silence and strategy still work. That possibility alone sends ripples through the halls of power, signaling to other influential men that control isn't always about rebuttal, it's about restraint. For now, all eyes remain on Diddy's legal machine, a small army of high-priced attorneys, investigators, and strategists working tirelessly to keep his empire from crumbling. Piece by piece, they're reclaiming control of the story, not through press conferences or social media campaigns, but by placing their trust in a system many believe is already broken. Their approach is unsettling in its simplicity. They're not swatting at every accusation. They're choosing their battles with precision, knowing that, in court, the loudest voice rarely matters. What counts is the case that survives scrutiny. If the evidence doesn't hold, if the witnesses fracture under cross-examination, if prosecutors miss a step, then the outcome shifts and Diddy doesn't just walk free. He does so with the weight of vindication, not cultural redemption, perhaps, but legal clarity, a technical freedom that doesn't silence the allegations, but strips them of consequence. That possibility has shaken the public, not because it's new, but because it's familiar. Time and again, men with wealth and power have sidestepped accountability when the law fell short of airtight. Justice demands perfection, and perfection is rare. Diddy's lawyers know this. They're exploiting every crack, every inconsistency, every procedural misstep. They've built a strategy cold in its precision, disciplined in its execution, and confident enough to hint publicly that his release is within reach. It's a reminder of how power operates. With enough money, enough influence, and the sharpest legal minds, freedom always feels closer. What's at stake isn't just Diddy's innocence, it's his legacy, his chance at a comeback, and the proof that the law, for those who can afford it, can serve as a shield. Whether one believes he is guilty or not almost becomes secondary to the larger truth. The system doesn't always serve justice. More often, it serves strategy, and right now, Diddy's team is running that playbook to perfection. They're shifting the tide slowly but decisively, signaling that his freedom isn't about forgiveness, it's about the law's limits. If they succeed, it won't simply be a victory for Diddy. It will stand as a message to everyone watching that the most damning accusations can be outrun. That freedom is not always tethered to truth, but to who can afford the best defense, because in the end, justice isn't always about right or wrong. Sometimes, it's just about who plays the game better.